right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us on another wonderful Saturday in the Ear Coast region. We are going to do the third of our 4 Ear Coast Child Protection webinars. And today we're going to talk about training. And we're going to talk about training for all members of the school community. There's a missing word there, but child protection training for all members of the school community. That's what we're going to be discussing today. Hi, Stacy. Thank you for your hand up. So we're going to go through different members of the school community. We're going to talk about appropriate training for them because, you know, the one training doesn't work for everybody. Everybody has different needs. And so we'll talk about the different trainings. We'll talk about the different needs and we'll kind of go from there. As always, there's 2 of us working here today. Good morning. There's 2 of us presenting here today, myself and Chris Gould. I think I'll let Chris do an introduction for himself first, and then I'll give a brief introduction for myself, and then we'll jump into the content. Chris?
Thanks, Matt, and good morning to everybody. Briefly, for those of you that are not aware of me, my name's Chris Gould. I'm an independent child protection consultant based, as Matt said, in Australia. I served in the British police force for over 30 years and worked mostly as a detective, heading up the child protection group and at the same time investigating major crime. So that's mostly where my background comes from, is the policing, which I finished my service as a detective chief superintendent. But whilst serving, I managed to get some funding from the Home Office and the European Commission, which helped me to undertake some research in various parts of the world on the issue of children and young people being abused whilst they're engaged on educational, cultural, or language trips abroad. And as a result of that research, I founded an international children's charity based in the UK, which when I finished with the police, I became the CEO, and then later the honorary vice president when I migrated to Australia in the end of 2013, and I set up my own safeguarding consultancy, which is 112 Safeguarding. And in May 2014, I was brought in to support the Jakarta Intercultural School with a significant abuse crisis, and separately worked with the FBI on the William Vahey case. So since then, all my work has been involved with the international school sector. That's me.
Wonderful. Now, Chris and I met actually as a result of some of that work, because I used to be the deputy head of school at the British School of Jakarta. So not just, but another school in Jakarta. And Chris came and provided in-depth training to all of us at BSJ. And I received my level 3 training, where you'll understand what level 3 training is shortly here. And through those discussions, Chris and I got to know each other. I learned quite a bit about child protection from Chris, and he helped me start childsafeguarding.com, and we worked together on that. And childsafeguarding.com provides training, but we provide training for one sector of the school community that is often underserved, and we're going to talk about that as we go through today. But it really was the type of trainings that we're discussing today that kind of led Chris and I to that work. And as Chris and I were talking about all of this and building out childsafeguarding.com and looking at schools and saying, well, there is a lot of need for training, but what are those full needs? That's where this work specifically around the training element of child protection came forward, where we said, you know, it'd be really helpful for schools if they had a roadmap to know how do they train everybody in child protection, because we have a motto that everyone has a role to play. Well, how do you actually do that? And so the work that we're going to talk about today is just one of those larger elements of child protection. And we already talked about the overview. We talked about the development of your kind of central child protection policy. Now we're taking a focus on the specific individuals. And this is one that's very close to both Chris and my heart, because this is what we do. This is something that's very important to us, to ensure that every adult pair of eyes, and maybe even smaller pairs of eyes, have an understanding on how to protect children within the school. So that's kind of our history, and that's how we got to here. As a reminder, this is the third of 4 webinars. So we have one more coming up in, I guess, about 3 weeks from now, where we're going to talk about the role of designated safeguarding lead. We have already held 2 Ear Coast webinars. If you were unable to attend those, I have absolutely no idea what else you would be doing on a Saturday, and so it's really quite embarrassing for you. But if you could not attend for whatever reason, please email me, and I'm happy to share with you some of the content and the recordings from those. Those are a little bit longer. This one today will be only an hour as opposed to the hour and a half ones that we did before. But I encourage you to join us for the last one, where we will talk about that role of the designated safeguarding lead as the central operational figure within schools who kind of oversees all the things that we've been talking about up to this point. And again, registration is free for all IRCOS members. And kind of to that point, I just want to say one more time that this has been a real pleasure working with IRCOS on this. The turnouts that we have in these webinars is just spectacular. Your engagements are great. And I think it's because of this wonderful IRCOS community. So I want to say thank you to IRCOS for inviting us to do this and giving us the opportunity to connect with all of you. So thank you for that. It's really been wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So as always, we like to start off with a definition of child protection to ensure that we have an understanding of what we mean and how we're connecting training to this key topic. So we'll talk about child protection in itself. We are going to talk a little bit about best practices and context. As I said before, we have a moniker where we say everyone has a role to play. So who's everyone when it comes to your school? Then we're going to do a review of various child protection trainings. You will get another handout to take home today, and then we'll put it all together at the end and talk about creating your training plan. All right. Now, we've said this before, and you guys have been great. I mean, I do many webinars and have for years. This group has been so wonderful in its engagement with questions and chats and all of that. So just keep it up. Like, it's been really great to have these conversations. So if you have any questions, any thoughts, any opinions, please throw them in the chat, throw them in the Q&A. We'll address them live. We have various things to talk with both myself and Chris to go into some depth here. But if there's something specific for your school, and there might be, there's a few things here that as Chris and I were preparing this, we said, oh, there might be some interesting discussions around that. Please throw it into the chat and join the conversation. Okay, so how do we define child protection? And you've seen this slide a couple times, but let's go through it again. But let's take this view from the learning context, from the training context. And as you remember, our definition is that child protection is the commitment and actions taken to protect children from abuse. So now when we think about that from a learning perspective, how do people know what their commitment should be or what they're committed to? And how do they know what appropriate action is? Because that's one of the major challenges of protecting children, is taking appropriate action or getting appropriate resources in to help you take those actions. Well, this is where training comes into place. And we really have the belief that, like I said, everyone has a role to play. Now, as you're thinking about your child protection as a frame towards understanding what trainings you need to provide at your school, like always, like we've said from the beginning here, what we're providing you is an overall framework, an overall overview of child protection training that is designed for an international context. But there may be requirements within your schools, in your locations, or even within the elements of those personnel that are working in your school that make things a little bit different. So because of that, your training requirements may vary. You may have other things that you need to do above and beyond, or to shift things around. There may be legal requirements. You know, Chris and I work with every single one of the countries that's on here today. We have done work with that country, and we've been looking more into the legal frameworks and the training requirements. And it's not consistent. You know, there are needs in every single one of your communities that you need to address as you're building out this training program and creating a training plan to ensure that everybody is fully trained in child protection kind of moving forward. So please bear that in mind. And as you do that, as we've said before, the things that we suggest that you take a good look at when you're looking at the context of your particular child protection programs and the trainings that feed that are, you know, the members of your school community. What are their backgrounds? What are their needs? You know, requirements for your individual school and the way that it operates, the communities you serve in terms of students. You know, what is your purpose? What are your academic requirements that you're trying to meet? That does have a lot of influence on how you approach child protection. And then, of course, the legal frameworks and the legal requirements within your countries are things that you need to be familiar with as you build out these trainings, or you bring people in to do the trainings for you. Okay, so then that comes back to our definition here. Child protection is the commitment and actions taken to protect children. And then I've alluded to this, I've said it straight out, but our belief is that it involves everybody, right? Child protection is something that is the responsibility of every member of the school community. And as such, everyone has a role to play. Well, if you naturally continue on with that discussion and that line of logic, you need to train everybody. Everybody needs to have an understanding of child protection requirements and practices and what to look for and how to implement those things at your school. Because the way that you create that program and you've developed that policy, maybe based on the first two webinars that we've talked about, your training then needs to show people how to engage with that in a correct manner. But we always get this question: who is everyone? So who are some of the groups that you would obviously think would be part of the everyone? And there's some that are really easy. Like we know that, you know, school leaders and teachers are obviously very clear on the list. But who are some of maybe the outliers that you think, wow, we really need to connect with those people as well, because they're part of our community and we're not doing enough work? So maybe you can put some ideas in the chat. Who are some of the everyone's, or the groups of people? Yeah, parents, that's a great one. Students, wonderful. Thank you, John. Non-academic staff, service providers, custodians, absolutely. So these are key members of our communities that we need to make sure are also included. Yep, custodians, we got 2 custodians there. Non-academic staff, I like that. These are some of the discussions that Chris and I had as we were building out various things. Staff members, teaching assistants, guardians, oh, that's a good one. Volunteers, yeah, absolutely. Students, I agree. Support staff, yep, absolutely. Bus drivers and monitors. Learning shadows, I've never heard that term before. Thank you, Kelly. Boarding staff, very good. Now, do boarding staff typically fall under the support staff arm, or are they a little bit different? Because that's one that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Security personnel, absolutely. So let's go through a few of them. And you're going to notice that I've kind of, we'll have organized these groups a little bit. So school leaders, teachers. One that is often overlooked, and Chris and I push on this quite a bit, is making sure that the ownership or the board are also trained, right? I mean, they're leading the school. Yeah, board members. Thank you, Jonna. Perfect timing. Thank you, Christopher. So the board does need to be trained. That's a big thing for us as well. Academic support. Now, we have a broad definition of academic support because I view academic support kind of coming in 2 realms. So maybe your teaching assistants and those providing logistical and direct support in the classroom, but then also learning support, counselors, nursing staff. We also view that as academic support. So ones that are teachers or teacher trained or working directly with students and providing support, but maybe not primarily teaching responsibilities. So that's a big one for us. Enrichment providers, I didn't see that one from folks. That's one that can always be an interesting one because some of them are contracted, some of them are internal, you know. But those folks that are providing ECAs or CCAs or whatever you call them, art teachers, music teachers, tutors, those sorts of things. So that's a group that we want to include. Okay, but what about the non-academic ones like support staff? So security guards, bus drivers, cleaners, maintenance workers, canteen staff. Thank you, perfect. Yeah, food service workers, absolutely. Contracted vendors. So a few of you mentioned that as well. Coaches for sports. Yeah, that's great. I kind of put those under enrichment providers, but yeah, that would work. Volunteers. So you have parents that hold many roles at your school. Sometimes they're volunteers. Sometimes we have people from the outside that are volunteers. And the challenge with these folks is that they're not contracted with you. They're volunteering. And as you know, volunteering doesn't always pay. Temporary teachers. Oh, there's a good one. So where are your relief staff? So we haven't addressed them as a group specifically here. That's good. Parents. Do parents need to be trained? The answer is yes. The answer is yes, and we will address them. What about visitors? What about the people that are on your campus just for a short amount of time? Do they need to be trained? Well, they have access to your school, so yeah, they do. And then, of course, one that we always want to put on here and is a pretty big challenge for most schools, and that is this idea of making sure that students are also trained. Now, as we've put this together and we've shared this with various groups, the relief teacher question has come up. Yeah, relief teachers, substitute teachers, temporary teachers. That's a big one. Another one that we get quite frequently is guardian staff or boarding staff. Yeah, outside guardians, those can come up. And kind of the thing that I would like to get across here is that every single one of these people does need to be trained in child protection. Every single one of them, okay? So now let's get into the hows. And before we get into the hows, I'm gonna invite everybody to download a copy of our child protection training overview. So I'll give you a second to do that because, as always, we have a handout to give you. Interns, oh, there's a good one. I haven't heard of that one. I'm just writing these down in the background because this is really good. Thank you very much, Aaron. Appreciate that. I was just about to do that, so thank you. Good. Yep. Matthew, it's right above you in the chat. You're welcome. Well, I'll say you're welcome, but Aaron did all the work. So the link is in the chat if you want to click on it. It's a downloadable PDF. We'll give you another couple seconds and then we'll move on from there. So this is a document that you can use, just like the other two documents that we provided you. This would be something that you can use, excuse me, to guide some of your child protection training planning so that you know basically kind of the big categories of programs that you need to offer, training materials that you need to make available, and who to offer them to. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about these various offerings and go into a little bit of depth on them. Now we've broken them up into three categories. Now you may have heard this before: level 1, level 2, level 3. And then we're going to talk a bit about child protection basics and child safeguarding awareness. And then we're going to talk about safeguarding induction and a child protection briefing. So as you look at those, you can probably see pretty clearly what groups that we're aiming at within those stakeholder groups that we talked about before. But let's go into a little bit of depth. Okay. So we're going to start talking about the more in-depth training that's designed specifically for teachers and leaders, whereas I'm calling them academics because a lot of the academic support staff will also be on this as well. Okay. So level 1. Now, Chris, can you just give us a brief overview of level 1? So I met Chris because I went through my level 1, level 2, level 3 training from Chris. And so what is kind of the main theme when it comes to level 1 training?
Yeah, level 1 is fundamentally it's the induction course, if you like, or the introduction to child safeguarding and child protection work. So it's the building blocks and some of the big building blocks for everything that's to follow. So as you can see, because of the international community, it starts with a strategic and operational side, so that we actually put the training in context with the international school environment. And then the building blocks from there start with, where does this all come from in relation to the original building blocks around the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and thresholds, frameworks into things like the types and signs of abuse and so on, just to give that cultural framework as well, more specific to individual schools in individual host countries. But basically, this is the entrance for the entry point into sort of safeguarding training per se.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple key words there, and that was the cultural framework for the school. So this is not always so sometimes this can be a generic course that can be done online, but when it's done online, we miss some of the context of working specifically in the school, right? So if this is done online through some online providers, that's fine for a number of reasons, and it can be quite effective, but you are going to miss those local issues or job-specific issues that do need to be addressed. And then Chris also mentioned this idea about a foundation. So this is a foundational course that's designed for those that have primary responsibility of working with students or have primary responsibility for students. I'm just curious, for those of you that are on the training today, how many of you have level 1 training? Can you just maybe put a few notes into the chat? Because I'm always curious to see how many have actually gone through this level 1 training. I like that. Yes. Okay. good. I'm going to let those go while I continue on. Now, the level 1 training is designed. Oh, I got a question here. Let me pull up the question. Okay. Level 1 is repeated every 3 years, but I'm assuming there are yearly regular reviews of the information. Chris, can you answer that? So Matthew has a question about refreshers. So as we can see down here in the bottom, the typical certification that's provided for level 1 training is good for 3 years, but his question is about yearly refreshers and catching up. What's the best practice for that?
Yeah, it's a good point. The standard procedure for a certificate in relation to a level 1 would be for the complete course, it would be around 3 years. But of course, in terms of practice, it's really important that organizations actually have that annual refresher. So what a refresher would be, it would extract some of the basic information from a level 1 course itself and probably add maybe some slight variations or nuances or additional information that's coming out that's specific to that area. And that would be included. So for example, at the beginning of every teaching year, there would be an induction program that would be specific for everyone who's coming back to the school, and of course to include new staff. And the key point there is that entry includes not only the content that you've created for that annual program, but it also includes your own very specific safeguarding framework and reporting procedures so that everybody gets to understand contextually how safeguarding and child protection works within your school.
Great. That was a great question. Thank you for mentioning that, Matthew. So a few things that we want you to recognize on the side here is that we have put in details, and these are in your handout as well, but some details about how we approach things. Now, we haven't included the specific stakeholder groups or specific people, but the idea on this one is that it is designed for teaching staff, leadership, governance as a foundational course. And some people will stop here. Those that don't have further, those that don't have additional safeguarding responsibilities or are kind of school leadership responsibilities may just stop at level 1. That's quite frequent. Others will need to go further. But just a couple of things to highlight here. This course is something that should be done every 3 years, as we just mentioned, and it's typically a 1-day course. Now, this can come in a combination of online or live learning. It can be done purely live. We do recommend that there is some live training that's related to the context of the school, and it's not done purely online. Okay. Now, after level 1, drum roll, there's going to be level 2. Hey, oh gosh, how did that happen? And this particular course is designed for a more in-depth understanding as part of a greater path. And what we find, and I'll let Chris kind of talk about this, we find that a lot of people don't stop at level 2. They will go on to level 3. But level 2 is designed for a greater understanding of the content in level 1 that is designed for people that have specific responsibilities or in a leadership capacity in school. Chris, can you talk about level 2 a little bit more, just to give us a better understanding of how it differs from level 1?
Yeah, I mean, this is a course that's definitely for DSLs, the designated safeguarding leads. You definitely need to do this one to aspire to becoming a fully trained designated safeguarding lead, but also for aspiring DSLs as well. And of course, some of the key stakeholder group, which might include some of the senior leadership or maybe even the representative from the board or something like that. This starts to go into the content in a little bit more detail. There's more case study, there's more almost crisis management work where you're starting to work with some of this material. Now, the content shown here isn't necessarily everything, and it might vary as well. And there may be additional materials depending on whereabouts in the world you are and what some of the more poignant issues are that you're dealing with on a sort of regular basis. So that can shape the content of your course as well. But nonetheless, we're now moving into a more in-depth strategic approach to safeguarding, as well as more detail around the operational side. So this is where it starts to turn on the heat a little bit for those those that are undertaking this course, and specifically, therefore, they will be people that have a significant interest in this because they are key stakeholders in the organisation, and there is a need to know how this operates.
So it's kind of, I mean, let's go back a slide just to talk a little bit more about the content and the approach, because I think it's important to compare the two. Excuse me, to compare the two. So in level 1, we are getting this induction that that helps employees understand the background of their responsibilities for child abuse prevention, things to look out for, their particular conduct, and then what they need to do should they run into issues in terms of supporting the students and using school resources. So it really is a across the board investigation of those materials. And then there are case studies, right? We talk about specific incidents and how you would handle them and facilitate some discussion. In level 2, though, as we say, we're going in greater depth. We're also taking a much more complex approach because we've now kind of shifted the focus from people that are being taught what to look for and how to do basic first level response to those that are taking active response. People that are going to be handling investigations, those that are going to be driving operational procedures and influencing the strategy of the school towards addressing child protection. So this one is less content focused from my experience. It's really designed more for depth of understanding and usability, right? How do you use that content within the framework of the school at a more advanced level? We have a couple questions here, so let me address them. And Lucy's asked the same question in 2 places, so that'll be really good. Do you have a list of certified providers in Asia? So luckily you have one of the providers on the course right now, and that is Chris. Chris does do this sort of training in Asia. There are others that are around, and one of the things we're doing at childsafeguarding.com is that we're actually looking to put together a list of consultants and resources that'll help you. But in the meantime, I would highly recommend talking to Chris because he can help you. And he, if he's unable to do the work, well, I'll let Chris say it. If you're unable to do the work, Chris, I'm sure that you have other people that you can help them with, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of organizations and individuals that do this type of work. It's generally down to location and sometimes preference. So I can certainly signpost you to either online programs that may be useful, or indeed trainers in different organizations that may be useful that will be in different parts of the world.
Okay, perfect. So we will include, well, Chris's information will be at the end of the presentation, and then we'll also include it again in the follow-up email. So thank you, Lucy. That's a great question. Because you bring up another point that I haven't highlighted yet, but I was hoping that some of you would see this. In the details, we talk about how long this needs to occur. Now, because this is a more in-depth course, it does usually take more time. So when I did it, we did 2 days of level 2 training. It kind of depends on the needs of the school as to whether that's done in a single long day session or 2 days. I would say that doing it over multiple days allows for more time for processing and discussion. So giving this more time is really important because the people that are doing this are kind of the central point of your child protection program. It does require level 1 training. We've already talked about who would do it, and it further is repeated every 3 years. But I want to highlight something on these slides, and that is who conducts the training. So let's go back to level 1 real briefly, and we'll say a qualified or experienced child protection trainer. That's very important because somebody can be trained as a trainer to provide level 1 training to allow your school to be able to do this internally. Level 2, though, requires accreditation. And so like Chris is an accredited professional trainer in this area. So he would be somebody that would work on the level 2 training. This particular topic, as you get into depth, is not something that can be done by a train the trainer model, because there are going to be some nuances and some special information. So to get level 2 training, it is going to be something that needs to be done by a professional. Okay. So after level 2 training, we get to level 3. And level 3 has a very big or in the middle, because level 3 actually bifurcates into two areas. One is key stakeholder training. So this is almost as if we've taken the previous two as a foundation, and now we're going to go even higher for our leadership and key stakeholders around their responsibilities for child protection. There are some specific items that are included in that. I do remember as we were going through it that we talked a lot about the roles of various officers and strategic responsibilities, but then a heavy view towards safer recruitment. Now, there are some key members of your safeguarding teams that are not necessarily senior leaders or have that strategic influence. And as we've talked about in the past, there is a difference between operational and strategic safeguarding. So the operational people also need level 3 training, especially if they're in absolute key roles. And so that's where specialist training comes in. So Chris, can you talk to us a little bit about the difference between the two areas of level 3 training, that training that focuses specifically on like DSLs and counselors and medical staff, and that's designed for kind of key stakeholders?
Yeah, this will vary depending on the organization, the shape of the organization, and the actual safeguarding framework that's in existence within the organization. But nonetheless, there are differences, and sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're a little bit more subtle. But of course, when you're doing a level 3 training with medical staff, I mean, the nurses and sometimes doctors, it's really important that we focus on their very specific needs, which actually is potentially significantly different from those of the designated safeguarding lead. Now, whilst the designated safeguarding lead needs an overview of the specialisms required by medical staff, the medical staff themselves actually need much more specific content around some of the forensic related issues and the healthcare. So that's really important that we try and differentiate. And of course, this is where things like safer recruitment come in, because actually, whilst an overview is required at a very high level for leadership, particularly, as well as the DSLs and those others responsible for child protection within the safeguarding framework, HR might need to be involved in the safer recruitment element, because it's broader than just doing interviews with potential recruits for the organization. And so it goes on. So, but the depth of this is really important. So a level 3 could be just a generic input for one particular group of stakeholders, or it could be a specialist module. So you move this to modular work, and whilst there is timing here for this is a generic course timing program that you've got here for typical duration. The point is that you might at one level just want a very specific input on cyber abuse or on sexual abuse or on FGM, just to enhance your knowledge or a group of your specialists' knowledge in that one particular area, because it's becoming a problem for your school or your organization. So therefore, that module might just be a few hours. So you can break this up into generic work covering the generic topics, or you can actually focus, once you get to level 3, on some of the specialist modules themselves.
It kind of feels, Chris, that it's kind of broken down into the strategic leadership people, the operational leadership people, and then, for lack of a better term, support and service providers. Is that a fair way to envision it? And then with kind of a special dispensation for the designated safeguarding lead, which I'll talk about more in just a second.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
okay.
That's fundamentally the areas that it breaks into.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have a question here. Sarah asks, if there is a group of us here online who would like to do level 2 and level 1 and level 2, and mainly the level 2 course, would you, Chris, be willing to arrange something online for us? Okay, so I'm going to let you contact Chris specifically about that, but that's a very good question, Sarah. So Chris, Sarah Elliott would like to chat with you afterwards. And I know this is work that you have done remotely because you're trapped in Australia. So that'll be great. Now, I do want to highlight one thing here, because as Chris mentioned, that this is kind of, we have two areas that we're focusing on, but there's well, three, I guess, if you talk about the needs of the child's, the designated safeguarding lead. But then we also have this. So part of the level 3 training can be working with the training providers as a train the trainer activity. And this is something that Chris does with certain schools and other trainers will do with certain schools, so that the designated safeguarding lead or somebody that is in a senior level position that has heavy influence over the operations and or strategy of the school, primarily the operations, can provide training at the school. So with that level 1 training, to bring people in from the outside on a regular basis can be costly and can be logistically challenging. And so sometimes we want somebody that can provide level 1 training. That star is there because this is the training provided, that this is the train the trainer will happen within this level 3, so that one of your internal employees can provide the level 1 training to others. So that's something that can be rather in depth. There's a bit of nuance in there. And so if that's something you're interested in, I would contact Chris directly about that. That's not something that we go into a lot. It is, again, a very in-depth training done by an accredited provider. And with this one, because it is kind of tied to some very specific actions and requirements for members of the school community, oftentimes there's a lot of pre-work that's done to generate topics, and there's a requirement for periodic reviews and connections to various people afterwards. So with work that Chris does, it often happens that he stays in contact with the people in level 3 because they do have regular questions and regular needs around safeguarding and child protection within the school. So these are really the key elements of the school itself. So level 1, level 2, level 3 covers your academics and your leadership. Okay, one question I'm going to ask you real quick, Chris, is board members. How many board members need to do level 3 training?
Well, in the perfect world, I'd like to see everyone on the board doing child protection training.
Right.
But this is constantly a problem that I'm aware of that international schools have, is actually trying to organize this sort of training to get this group of people together in one room to actually do this stuff together. Nonetheless, I think aspirationally that should be what we're trying to do. Ideally, if that doesn't work, then definitely I would try and focus on identifying a safeguarding lead within the board or the governing group, so that at the very least, the head of the school, the director, has actually got somebody at board level who understands and has been through the whole process of training right up to level 3, so that when you're talking and having a conversation at board level about a specific issue, that when you're using certain words and phrases, that at least somebody on the board understands what you're talking about, and they become critical when it comes to a crisis or a significant incident, because they may well be the very individual or the very group of people that will be actually fronting the media in the event of a significant case. So it's really important that they use the right terminology, that they understand every element around the evidence trail, and that they know how to deal with the media when it comes to this sort of thing, as has been experienced by a number of schools around the region historically. So it's really important that they do get some training, but definitely go for the safeguarding specialist within the board if you can do that.
Now, there's another reason for that you and I've talked about, and we've mentioned it here, and I just need to hit it again because it's been one of the largest learnings that I've had, is that there is that separation between the strategic and the operational safeguarding. And so what I worry about when the board members don't do this training, is that they think that they're going to be involved in operational elements within safeguarding. And that's not why we want them to do this. Now, there are the operational elements of incident and crisis management, but honestly, they're there to set the tone culturally for the entire school, right? They hire the leaders, they set the budgets, they do these sorts of things. So they need to be involved in the strategy and culture around child protection and show that it comes from the top. And so having that strategic cultural commitment from the board is critical. And that's another reason why we want them to do this training. Okay, all right. So those, frankly, sorry, are actually the easy ones. It's very in-depth. Those are important. There's a lot that they need to cover. But within a school, as we address everybody, the academics and the school leadership are the obvious ones to target. So what we'd like to talk about now is other people, like non-academic employees and volunteers. So we've gone through our list. We know that there are a number of other people that have access to the school and excuse me, that work at the school, that are on campus. We need to make sure they're trained as well. Their needs, however, and their access and their responsibilities suggest that there are other classes and other courses that need to be offered that are a little bit different. And so we're going to go through two other trainings that are specifically designed for these non-academic employees. It's not all non-academic employees. Some of them will be academics in a different sense, but these trainings are designed to be less intense, less in depth, but cover the key elements of requirement for making sure that those that have access to the campus know what to do if they have child protection concerns. They understand the basics around abuse types. They know about behavioral responsibilities, and they're given some level of certification in order to do that. So, so the first thing that we suggest or that we find is this child protection basics course. So remember, level 1 is an induction course, and it's designed for teachers. So imagine that you're in a building. Okay, so if level 1 is level 1, then this would be kind of basement 1. This is right below that. And so it's the same idea around the content, but it's not designed to be as in depth. It doesn't give as much history and connections to legal frameworks on a global scale. It is designed more specific to the school itself and for a more basic approach of understanding the responsibilities of working with children. It's primarily designed for non-permanent teaching staff. So like you said, relief teachers, coaches, teaching assistants even sometimes will do this course, especially if the other one is more in depth. Vendors with regular contact with students. And this is important in a couple senses. Number one, we want to make it very clear that child protection responsibilities are included for those people that are not on campus every day. We also want to recognize that those that are not necessarily on campus every day are still seeing a lot of things. And we'll get to the support staff in just a minute. There's a little bit of difference in this one. This training is typically done in-house. Sometimes there's an online version, but we rarely bring in an outside person to do this. So the designated safeguarding lead is usually the typical person that will offer this kind of training because they have some level in being qualified or experienced in training, and they'll know the nuances of the school that need to be highlighted within this work, okay? No previous experience required. It's usually a shorter experience, so it's not terribly long. It will be it'll be an hour to 3 hour course that's available to our coaches and our peripatetic providers, our tutors, those sorts of things. There's not usually any pre or post work. It's something that we just kind of do with them, but it does need to be done every 12 months. And one of the challenges that we run into is how do you ensure that everybody is appropriately trained? And this is where we're going to get to the support staff element there. Typically what we find when schools do this is that they do it at the beginning of the academic year, and there can be a gap. And the gap is the thing that I would like you to think about as you're thinking about your training, because the level 1 training is almost always done in some sort of induction prior to the first day of school. Every once in a while, it'll be during a special week during the school. It's not always common to do that. But with that model and the model that I'm saying here, it does require that you've scheduled everybody, you've made the room available, you've bought the coffee and cake, and people are sitting in a room together. That's great. Let's say that you did that on October 1st. What happens for the coach that was hired on October 2nd? Are they going to have to wait a year to do this training? So one of the things that Chris and I talk about is having materials and having training available that works for those off-cycle employees. Okay, So, and we address this within childsafeguarding.com, and I'll get to that in a minute. But as you're looking at this, it is important that you have that addressed of not only being able to provide the content, but providing access to it for people that come later, so that you don't have the worry that we have people on our campus who have not been child protection trained. Okay. The reason that we do this every 12 months is that it's a less in-depth course, but they do have primary interactions with students. So because it's less in depth, we need to revisit that course on a regular basis, and we need to ensure they understand what they're doing and be reminded of those key responsibilities every year. Okay. So again, this is really designed for the relief teachers and those that are working directly with students. Now, what about support staff? And this is where Chris and I kind of jumped into helping schools. And this is why we created childsafeguarding.com. And we created childsafeguarding.com because as you get further down, let's say the mall, right? So now we're in B2 instead of B1. The complexity of the learner profile gets higher. So with our relief teachers and our TAs and our tutors, there still is a pretty decent amount of educational experience, and often language skills are generally able to handle English. Well, when we talk to support staff, a majority of them are locally hired. They have quite a bit of variance around child protection experience and educational experience, and this is why we built out childsafeguarding.com. And what we provide is online child protection training for that group that's designed for a more universal understanding in terms of instructional design and done on demand. And also we address the language elements because you're going to have people that speak multiple languages. Now, not everybody uses us, totally understand that a lot of people build out internal courses. That's great. What I would recommend as you're building that out is that you focus on a few things. Number one, accessibility, because you are going to have employees that come in all throughout the year. You cannot do a one-off induction course and meet the needs of these folks. You do need to have content that is designed for their responsibilities. So we don't need to go in depth as we do with the teachers or the relief teachers, but we need to make it very clear that they are responsible for child protection, that they need to report whatever they see, and that they're safe to report. One of the big things that we saw in doing research for childsafeguarding.com is that a number of people were worried that they just were going to lose their jobs. So we don't do that. And then having a connection to language and context. People will learn best if they learn in their mother tongue language. Okay. Now, if you decide to use an online program like ours, it is important that our course or courses similar to ours are really focused for generics and basics and universal understanding. And there are school-specific content and contexts that are important to include. So the schools that use our course really quite well will use ours to do on-demand training whenever they need it throughout the year. So everybody has child protection trainings. And then once or twice a year, they'll do face-to-face sessions where they talk about what it's like to work in a school in Hanoi as a food service worker or something, right? And so they're giving them specific training for that particular school, okay? So I have a question here. Will we be given some ideas with respect to charges for the different trainings for individuals, groups, online and in-person courses? It depends on the trainer. You know, every training, everyone charges a different amount. There's not really uniform costs for these. Obviously, we have a uniform cost because we're doing ours online. But yeah, it depends on the trainer themselves. You'll need to contact the trainers and kind of see what their costs are, okay? This particular training should be done every 2 years, the stuff for the support staff, so that we remind them. A lot of our support staff stay a long time, and a lot of our support staff are transient. So you need to have an understanding of how to address that. And what we suggest is that everybody that doesn't have primary student connection, like volunteers or support staff, should go through this. Okay. Great. Okay, so let's move on to everybody else, because there are everybody else's that we do want to focus on. And you mentioned them already, but let's hit all three of them. So let's talk about parents and let's talk about students. And we're not going to go a ton of depth on either of these because these are things that you and your school need to do to meet the needs of your communities. And we don't know what your communities are, but they are members that need to be addressed. And what we suggest is that you create for parents a safeguarding induction training. And this is designed specifically for those parents that are not volunteers, that are not part of the PTA, the ones that just have irregular contact with the school, but they are part of the community. It should cover appropriate behavior, roles and responsibilities, key policies, and reporting. This should really, so we talked about signage and we talked about agreements and policies. This should really open everyone's eyes to what their responsibilities are as parents within the community related to those policies, okay? And then the big question we frequently get, and we maybe even do a whole webinar, I don't know, Chris, maybe we should do this on how do you do child protection training for students? And this is this can be a difficult one because it needs to be integrated into the curriculum, not as an add-on. It needs to be age appropriate. It needs to be culturally appropriate. And the language used, whether that is different languages like Spanish or English or Arabic or Mandarin, or the language of being safe, needs to be specific to your students. So it does take a bit of time to integrate this in, but it does need to be a part of it. And the way that I've seen a lot of schools do it is they include it into like a social emotional learning, PHSE, and they will do it for everybody from the preschoolers to the ones that are about to graduate. Do you want to share any thoughts about parents or students, Chris? Because I know this is something that you do as well.
Yeah, very, very specifically, just on the back of what you've just mentioned, I think it's really important that when you're looking at student curriculum, first of all, that you focus end to end within your organization. So don't just tackle the older students, the teenagers. Do this from kindergarten right the way through to year 12, age appropriate, as you say, Matt. The other thing with that curriculum material that you choose, which will be different for each of these particular age groups, is that my advice is to make sure that you've found material which has been academically reviewed rigorously, and that as a result of that academic review, it's been accredited by the academics who reviewed it, because there's so much material on the market, and not much of it, but there is a lot of material out there which is not fit for purpose. In other words, it hasn't been tested with any longevity to check whether it actually resonates with children in the longer term and has any value. So the important thing is to make sure that it has been reviewed and it has passed those accreditation points. With parents, you've put a few ideas here on the screen just to show how you might work with parents, but the list is endless, really. I mean, it's down to different organizations or different ways of doing this. You come up with different methodology as to how you drip feed this into parents across their period of time within the school, because otherwise to actually try and do this as a one-off won't work necessarily. It will work for some parents but not for others. So the challenge is to drip feed across the years.
That's a great point. We have a question here maybe you can help address, and that Aaron asked, for students, how long should the sessions be held for them? How long would the training session?
Well, I would just integrate it into the PSHE or equivalent programs and just do it as per normal. You break it up into the bite-sized chunks, and most of these programs are broken into those specific modular size bite chunks, and then use it in that way. And that might be, once, twice a week, or it might be once every couple of weeks, but it depends what the program is. And they won't be long.
Okay. One of the challenges with parents, as you mentioned, is there's so much content and context that is specific. And Chris, you mentioned it, and you did a nice job of explaining it, but let me just go a little bit more in depth. The realities of a school in a specific country with a specific community are going to be unique. So having a universal one is rather difficult to provide. Further, you have such variability around your parents in terms of their backgrounds, their languages, their cultures, and their involvement with the school. And I mean, those of us that have done coffee mornings for here and to the moon, you know that you get the same 8 parents at every coffee, but you need everybody to do this. And so finding a way, like Chris said, to drip feed it or make it easily accessible, or some requirements of having this knowledge is important, but it needs to be specific to the needs and requirements and duties of the school. Okay. Okay, so Aaron asks a little bit more depth for Chris. This is a question for Chris. If we were to design lessons, would the South Australian Child Protection Framework be an ideal document to start with? That's perfect.
It's a great one. It's one of the ones that I would recommend across the globe. It's definitely one of the better ones. It's well accredited, and it is now slowly being used in a number of international schools. So yeah, I definitely consider that one.
Okay, great. Hey, Aaron, can you put that a link, or can you put that name into the chat so everybody can see that and they just have something there to work with? That's really helpful. Okay, so now let's talk about the last group. What would be the name for that document? Matthew asked the question, what would be the name for that document? Which document are you talking about? The one that Aaron mentioned? It was the South Australia Child Protection Framework. Gotcha. So Aaron, hopefully you can throw that into the chat. So the last group that we suggest that you focus on is visitors. Think about those short-term visitors that are there for less than a day or for a short amount of time. They do need to have some child protection training. And what we suggest is that you create a child protection briefing for visitors. Talking about very briefly behaviors, policies, requirements, reporting information, and it should be mandatory upon entrance that everybody reads this and signs off on it. Now, Matthew actually helped us move along. Matthew just asked the question here around how do we further support visitors? Because we had mentioned in the first webinar about ID card inserts. And in the intervening time with Matthew's suggestion and help, we created some. So if you're interested in having ID card inserts for your visitors, just send me an email. We're going to make them publicly available in January, but if you send me an email, I will email them right back to you. And what you can do with these is you can type in your own personal reporting information, print them out, and insert them into any ID badge, just so people understand what their requirements are. Now, we do suggest that beyond having a real clear short briefing that's maybe a page or a short video or something, is that you have all of these items in place to make sure that you're covering everybody in terms of their understanding around child protection is visible around campus. And as we talked about quite a bit, everybody wears an ID. That's a big thing. Okay, so now we've talked about the different trainings. Let's talk about who does them. And I'll go through this briefly because you have it in your handout, and then we'll talk about making a plan. Okay, so who does what? Well, in terms of school leaders, they do need to go through that level 3 training. So that's something that we highly recommend. Teachers, unless they have a safeguarding or larger responsibility within the school, level 1 training is sufficient for them. We already mentioned this point around boards and owners, that we find it to be most appropriate that they do level 3 training because of their requirements around incident management and around the strategy around child protection for the school. So level 3 training is appropriate for them. Academic support's an interesting one because, as I said, it's a very broad definition the way that I'm looking at it. If you have school counselors and nurses or ones that are going to be providing services in terms of safeguarding and child protection, they need to do level 3. If they are maybe TAs that are just working in the classroom and might have some difficulty accessing level 1, or it's just too much for them, the child protection basics is sufficient. Okay. Enrichment providers do need to do the child protection basics course. That would be appropriate for them and their access to students. Support staff, contracted staff, and volunteers, we suggest doing the child safeguarding awareness course, similar to the one that I mentioned, whether that's done internally or externally through us as a provider. That one, as I said, that should be a biannual piece of work because it will give the basics. And what this particular course will do is it will give people an understanding of their responsibilities and tell them that they should be reporting their information, but then also makes it clear that they are not to take direct action to solve abuse problems. That's the responsibility of the designated safeguard leader. Okay, so this pretty much turns everybody that's not an academic staff member into a pair of eyes that are talking about what they see. We talked about the parents going through an induction program that's developed by the school, students having integrated learning within the curriculum, and then visitors being briefed as they come onto campus. Okay, so you have that kind of as a roadmap to think about how do we bring people in, how do we make sure that everybody gets appropriate training that is aligned to their roles and responsibilities. Now let's talk about making a plan. So how do you plan your child protection training? And my first suggestion for planning your child protection training is to start with a plan. So make a plan for your plan, right? As you're making your plan, include experts like a Chris or somebody similar and stakeholders in the school, because they'll have a better understanding of kind of those specific requirements, whether it's the needs of student learning or the roles and responsibilities, or working with board members to have appropriate training. So this is not something that should be just done by a school leadership or an individual committee. Others need to bring this back. The other thing that I would recommend that you have in your plan is that you look over time. The number of times that Chris and I have gone into schools and we've heard, well, we did our child protection training a few years ago, but we haven't done it since, right? Chris, is this a common thing that you hear when people bring you in?
Very common. So definitely worth, I think partly this is to do with the fact that there's a lot of movement in international schools. And if there's not good record keeping on who's done what, then we lose the history, and that's really important. Yeah,
so record keeping, and we'll talk about that next. But not next, it'll be in a second here. But also making sure that the time elements of refreshers and revisitation and coming back to it are done. A lot of people see this as a one-off or a critical element because of accreditation or some rule, some need, and then they don't revisit it. So make sure that schedule for revisitation is in that plan. Do ensure that everybody's trained. So do you have you addressed all of those groups that I've talked about? Have that as maybe even page 1 of the plan. This is what the security guards will do. This is what the primary school teachers are going to do. This is what our parents are going to do. And having that in one central table kind of lets you, that makes it so you can say everyone is trained in child protection. And then, as Chris mentioned, focus on documentation and what we like to call evergreen materials. So as we said, have that written plan to cover all stakeholder groups, create a training schedule that includes recertification, track and monitor. So make sure that everybody's training histories, and then create actionable takeaways. And Chris is very good about this as well in his training, is that he will give you things that will give you reminders of the key information you've learned, but then also give you things that you can take action on should you have a report. So that's important. People are going to go through this one training every 3 years and have a refresher every year, but having actionable materials is really quite important. And then finally, and we mentioned this a number of times, including the local context, the locally available resources and legal requirements is absolutely critical. So it's one of the challenges of our training is that we do universal training, but our training is good for you to understand your role within the school, but we're not going to be able to tell you what your school needs to do in terms of working in Bangkok. And what are the materials there? What are the legal requirements? So having that included in your trainings so that everything is not just generic, it is really critically important. Okay. And those are the big things. As mentioned before, if you'd like to actually try one of these trainings for your support staff, or as something that's a language option for some of your non-English speaking members of staff, happy to offer it to you. I did have to update this slide because we're now in 26 countries and we've just passed 13,000 certificates over the last few months, and we've added a 25th language. And Chris and I got a very nice email earlier this month where our course has been internationally recognized as a finalist for a BET award. So it's been very exciting for us. So if you'd like to try it out, send me a note. I will give you, I can send you some materials, or you can try out the course itself and see what it looks like as part of an overall child protection plan. We do have some materials for you if you want to go in a little more depth. This is very helpful for you to understand a little bit more of where the training comes from. And then, as I mentioned, we have another webinar. We got one last one, and I would recommend that everybody join, even if you're not a DSL, so that you can understand kind of the role of the DSL and how that works within a school. But we are going to go through the role of the designated safeguarding lead and how kind of resourcing and how it works and where it is within the operational and strategic elements of the school, and even give you a sample job description to play with. So please join us for the next webinar. And with that, Chris and I will be here to answer any questions you may have. You will get a certificate of attendance, and we'll share all the content here as well. And as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, and I noticed somebody already sent me a note, if you would like copies of the previous recordings because you couldn't attend, please send me a note. Or if you would like copy some of those inserts for your IDs, send me a note as well. I'm happy to share. And yeah, so Chris and I will stay on if anybody has any questions. Please put them in the chat. Thank you for joining us again on a Saturday. I like all the thank yous. You're welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good weekend too, Justin. Great. Look at all these thank yous. I love it. You guys are wonderful. I really do enjoy, I don't know about you, Chris, but to have so much engagement and questions about these things from a webinar on a Saturday, I think is excellent.
I think it's a bonus that some people are prepared to put so much effort in on a Saturday, which is fantastic. And yeah, the engagement is great. It's good to have questions. And I'm already getting some emails, so people are already taking action, which is great.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Lori. And then Christine mentioned something in the chat, but all of these thank yous are pushing it way up to the top. Christine mentioned that if you don't have a chance to email me, that the recordings are available through Earcoast as well. So thank you, Christine, for that clarification. That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Enriched again. Thank you very much. I'm glad. Look at all these thank yous. Yeah. Thank you for the engagement. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for your time. Again, like Chris said, on a Saturday. Yeah. I get to go take a child to gymnastics camp in just a minute. And I don't know, do you have anything fun today, Chris, that you're going to do?
Back in the garden before the rains hit, I think.
Oh, very good. That's very good. Yeah. Okay, so let me see what the question is here. Thank you for a question. So Kelly is asking about your costs for training either a school or an individual. Kelly, why don't you connect with Chris directly? Can you... why don't you put in the question, because I think we're the only ones that can see it. Can you put your email address in there, Kelly? And then I will give that directly to Chris. Okay. Have a nice weekend, you too. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And we're still on. If anybody wants has any questions, we'll stay on for a few minutes. Thank you, Kelly. Please do let us know if you have any questions. All right, well, it looks like everybody is going to go enjoy their Saturday. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording here. Please have a wonderful weekend, and we will hopefully see you in about 3 weeks. All right.